Great. Excited to be here with y'all talking about Angular today, especially at a very .NET heavy conference. Sometimes you feel a little alone, so I'm glad we get to rock out and be excited about Angular for the next 30 minutes. Okay, I do have slides. Fantastic. All right, so we're going to be talking about Indiana Jones and the hidden secrets of the Forms API. Has anybody seen the new movie yet? No? Okay. All right, I've got it stashed for my flight on the ride home, but I am a big fan of the series. A little bit about myself, like Alyssa mentioned, my name is Jennifer Wadella. I can be followed on Twitter until it crashes at OMG it's Fetty. I hail from the middle of the United States. I'm from a little place called Kansas City. We are very culturally relevant right now because our football tight end is dating Taylor Swift. So if you've been hearing nonstop about Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, sorry not sorry, I ship them very, very hard. But anyway, that's where I come from, and so we're all very, very excited about this. Okay, jokes aside, I'm the VP of Front-End Engineering at a consulting firm called Bitovi. We're a boutique JavaScript consultancy, very high-level expertise. So I lead a team of front-end engineers who are experts in both Angular and React and a lot of different front-end frameworks, but we work with teams to try and help them build software in a better way. So see a lot of things done a lot of interesting ways in consulting, especially when .NET developers try and write Angular code. We all know how that turns out. It's not pretty. Yeah. You laugh because you know. So lots of lessons to be learned, especially when it comes to implementing forms. I'm an Angular GDE, the co-host of the Angular Plus Show podcast. Does anybody listen to the Angular Plus Show? Okay, if you're looking for a new podcast, it is the official podcast of the Angular conference in Salt Lake City that happens every year in the US. We cover a variety of topics, Angular and general software development. So if you're looking for something on your journey, if you're still working in person or anything like that, would encourage you to listen. And I would also consider myself a discoverer of API mysteries, or reading the docs. So that's going to be kind of the crux of this talk today. Okay, so let's get started and talk about discovering the hidden secrets of the ReactiveForms API. You may be familiar with the fact that we have the template-driven forms API and the ReactiveForms-driven API in the Angular ecosystem. Most of this talk is going to be focused on the ReactiveForms API, but I'm going to let you in on a little secret that both those APIs share the same common modules, and a lot of the same underlying principles are available for both if you just know how to use them. So when it comes to discovering secrets, this is kind of how most of us approach web development. We are trying to get from point A to point B as quickly as we can. We have some feature that business wants us to implement. We may have decent requirements if we're lucky, and so we are just trying to figure out how to write that code as quickly as possible to satisfy our requirements, write our tests, and move on. Point A to point B as quickly as we can. Well, this does not leave us a lot of time or a lot of ability to do kind of a discovery journey and really dig into the possibilities of the things that we're working with, particularly with APIs. So for the next 25 to 30 minutes, I want to help you go a little bit wider than just point A to point B and really dive into the API, so the next time you encounter some sort of problem, you're more aware of things you may not have realized were at your disposal when dealing with the Angular Forms API. So if we are to look at the code that is under the hood in Angular, digging into the ReactiveForms module, we find a lot of different treasures that are ready for and available for us to consume. And I say this because I think the biggest mistake that I see when it comes to developers writing Angular Forms code is reinventing the wheel simply because they don't understand what's already available in the API. And I'll call out some examples of that as I go through this. So some of the treasures that we have in this API are validators. There's a lot of built-in validation for us already available, including email validation. You may not have known that. You're probably familiar with the required validator, but we have a bunch of decent validators already built in for us and available to use. We have value accessor directives. This is a very complex topic that I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation, but these are all there and available built into Angular under the hood for your use. We have status directives. These are directives that give us all sorts of fancy stuff, I'm going to say for now, that relate to as we're dealing with form controls, and I'll dive in more in depth there later. We also have form control directives. So these are ways that we can take form elements and tie them to our components and different pieces that we're building. So all this available and ready for you by default in the Angular Forms reactive module, and we'll kind of dive into the different ways that these can help us. So I want to frame this talk by giving you a couple different form scenarios, and you probably have run into these at some point in your Angular career building forms, and you've probably struggled with them at some point building forms. So the first one is changing an input's requiredness when it's dependent on another input. So we are filling out a form, a user enters some piece of information in one input. Well, because of that information, we want a different form field to change validation or its requiredness based on the information in that form. Fairly common problem. How do we solve this just using the API? How do we deal with custom validation just using the API? This one I see people get stuck on a lot, adding and removing inputs dynamically. Let's think about the Slack interface, for example. If you've ever gone to add somebody to a Slack group or a channel or something like that, you might click a plus button a bunch of different times to add different people. How do we emulate that in an Angular Forms environment where we are able to add and remove inputs dynamically and get that data? Spoiler alert, you can do it just with the Angular Forms API. How do we create custom reusable form elements, especially if you are dealing with design systems or building web component libraries? How can we build these in a really elegant way? Again, just using the Angular Forms API. Similarly, how can we consume third-party libraries or web components that maybe don't have the hookups that we need? And also, how do we create forms based on JSON structure? Maybe you're dealing with a backend, you've got highly dynamic form data, and you need to build out or scaffold some sort of form based on a response from an endpoint that's going to give you back some JSON. How can we do that using just the Angular Forms API? And then finally, maybe if you are building some sort of form wizard, you've got a multi-step form component where you're navigating across components or across routes or different things. How do we bridge that gap? How do we deal with one parent form group containing all of our information when we're dealing with dynamic components and routes? So those are the scenarios that we're going to attempt to solve today in our archaeological journey. So that brings us to Form Archaeology 101. So this is just the basics of the Angular API, the stuff you really need to know to get started. So we're going to start with our basic building blocks. This is our form control. This is that thing in Angular that is going to tie some sort of element to a value and status. So this is your basic radio, this is your input, this is your select. All of these are examples of form controls. Those form controls are going to take a value, they are going to have a state where they are managing their validity, whether they've been interacted with, tracking their validation status. So those are our very basic building blocks that you need to think about. This is essentially a key value pair, right? If we're talking about submitting form data, we want, first name and then the value there. That is what this form control is going to give us. Next up, we have a form group. This is simply a grouping of form controls. So this allows us to build, more dynamic objects where we have multiple key value pairs that are built on by form controls. Form groups can be comprised of form controls. They can be comprised of other form groups. They can be comprised of form arrays. So form array is kind of our third building block here, which is an array of form controls. So when we start to talk about how do we create those dynamic forms where we're inserting and removing controls dynamically, we're going to do those inside of a form array. Acts just like a JavaScript array, but helps us manage the output of our forms better. So one of the things that I like to point out is all of these extend this abstract control class under the hood. And so this is my favorite piece of documentation to have open on the Angular website, because this is going to list everything that's available for you on your form controls, your form groups, and your form arrays. Form groups and form arrays will have a couple different methods layered on top of this, but this is a really great thing to get very, very familiar with this class and all of the different properties and methods that are available to you. So this is a great reference point. Obviously, we're going to have a prop that contains the value. We're going to have a status of our form if it's been interacted with. We have both valid and invalid for tracking the validity of our form. We just have a whole host of different attributes that are there and available and built into us for us to deal with. We have enabled, we have disabled, and then we have a bunch of different ones that are more related to what we want to do with the UI. And so those are things like pristine, dirty, touched, and untouched. I don't know if you've ever been interacting with a form and you start filling it out, right? And you get to one field and you type in your information in your blur, and then everything else highlights red. And you're like, calm down form. I know I haven't filled out those fields yet. You don't need to tell me they're invalid. Well, this is what we need to hook into that Angular provides us to provide that UI. We want something to happen when we want to show a user that something is required. Maybe it's outlining a form control in red. We can do this by understanding the state of the form. We probably don't want to show that validation status to somebody until they've actually interacted with that form element itself, or it tends to be a really annoying user experience. So we can only show that if this form control is set to touched. So if we think back to native DOM implementation, we click into an input field and we click out of it. We have a blur event that's emitted. That's what's happening here, where we've blurred outside of it. Okay, we understand that the user's interacted with it. Now let's maybe apply that red border class to it or something like that. So these are the different properties that are available for us that are, again, just there by default. So as soon as you have put a form control in your in your component, these classes or statuses are going to be directly applied based on all of this. So a whole host of different properties there, and then we also have all of our different methods. These allow us to interact with our form controls. This is called the ReactiveForms Module. They're not truly reactive, but that's a whole nother session. But this does allow us to, for instance, subscribe to value changes. So if we want to be alerted anytime a value changes on one of our inputs, we can subscribe to that stream. We can also do a bunch of methods like setting validators. If we need to change the validators of an input control because it's dependent on another one, we can call that with set validators. We have other methods that are available that help us interact more. For instance, we could do mark as touched. Let's say we have a form control, we're having to do a little bit of custom work with it, but we want to call the mark as touched method to apply certain directives. All of that is available. So I'm not going to go through absolutely everything that's available in the abstract control. My big picture here is this is your happy place to get really, really familiar with. This contains a lot of the treasure that you need to have a really good understanding of the Angular Forms API just by understanding these properties and methods that are available to you on the abstract control class. All right, so moving on, I just want to do a quick overview of what these different building blocks look like. This is a basic implementation of a form control where we are calling new form control, and that first parameter that we're passing it is whatever that initial value might be. So this should feel somewhat familiar to you. This is how we initialize it, and then inside of our template, oh, that is terrible highlighting color, we have our form control directive where we're binding it to whatever we've named it inside of our component. Next up, we have our form group. So I'll start with the initialization here, where it's just going to take an object that is going to contain anything in it. This could be a bunch of form controls. This could be more form groups. This could be form arrays. But that's what a form group looks like. And then we also have our form group directive on the top of the form there that you're going to pass in whatever member on your class contains that form. And then finally, we have our form array. So very familiar to form group. This is going to take an array, could be whatever, could be multiple form groups, could be multiple form controls, but this is an array, so it allows us to interact and create something very dynamically if we need to insert or remove different things from it, be it a form group or control or array. Okay. So I wanted to talk about the ng control status and ng control status group a little bit because these I feel like are so powerful and you may not even realize they're there. But this is a directive that applies classes automatically anytime you're using a form control, form array, or form group. So that means if you want to hook into your forms to show something, let's say that red outline if something is invalid, we actually have this class that is getting added to your form control if you go and expect this in the DOM. So you don't have to go and write an additional CSS class or anything like that. You can just hook into this ng invalid or ng touched or untouched or anything you want to do. These are all applied and update dynamically as you're interacting with your form control. And this is definitely something that I've seen a lot before where people understand, okay, I need to do something to show the user, so they go and they write a different class, and then, okay, they do their form control, and then they check the form control's validity, and then they apply a class based on that. This is all already done for you. The Google team has done y'all a solid by making this all there and available. You just need to know that it's happening and be able to hook into it. So that control status directive is for our form control, and then the control status group is applied to our array and our form group. So if you want to interact with things at a larger level instead of just going control by control, those directives are also applied at that top level. The next thing that we have built in is our validation. Like I mentioned, we have several built-in validators. So if we're initializing a form control, we're going to pass it a second parameter. This parameter we can pass in different validators, like our basic one required, and it's just going to essentially validate that that form has a value. We have other built-in validators, so we've got min and max, we've got email, we've got max length, so a lot of these are there and available for you. I'm going to talk about two specifically, though, that help us cover most of our edge cases, and the first one is pattern validation, because we all love regexes so much, right? Yeah. But what is really cool is we can do custom pattern validation very, very easily just by calling the pattern method on the validator and passing it in whatever we might have. In this case, I am trying to be very kind to the other developers. I've said, hey, this is my specifically named regex pattern that does this. I pass that in, and then that's going to validate for a date of birth, at least in US format, I believe. So this is your way to handle some of those more complex validation situations where you're validating against a certain format. Maybe it's a currency, maybe it's decimal points, something like that. This is a validator that's built in for you that'll just take any regex pattern that you pass it. And then next up is our function validation. And so this is what is going to help us handle our custom validation when we're dealing with a bunch of dynamic properties. I feel like a really great example of this is a date picker on an airline website. Let's say you're booking a round-trip flight, you have to pick your departure date, and then you want to pick your return date. Well, you want to validate and make sure your return date isn't before your departure date, and that doesn't make sense. So this is how we would do this in Angular using our function validation. So what this is going to do is it's going to take in a function. That function is going to take a form control, and so that's going to be able to give us access to whatever we need on that form control, which is typically the value. So maybe that value is dynamic and changing. So we choose our departure date, it's October 10th. Okay, now we can access what that departure date is in here. We can compare it against something else, be it another form control, be it a static value, and write our custom validation that way, and then return whether something is valid or not. So anytime you need to do the dynamic validation to determine what the state of a form should be based on other information, or your function validation is how you can do it. So in order to use a function validator, you just pass in your validators prop, and then inside that array, you pass in this function, and as long as it takes a type of a form control, you're going to be set there. All right, that brings us to Form Archaeology 102. So this is where stuff gets a little bit more advanced. So we're going to talk about some utilities and some built-in functions that the Angular team has given us to make life a little bit easier. Number one is form control name. This is a directive that ties a DOM element to a form control by its name instead of a member. So this helps us when we get into more dynamic, complex forms where we're multiple layers deep and being able to look things up. Similarly, we have the form group name and we have the form array name. Same thing conceptually. They give us an easier, more readable way to access our different pieces inside of our parent form. And then finally, form builder. This is just a shorthand syntactic sugar that's available for us. I like to call this out because a lot of times when people are looking at Stack Overflow examples, they might not clock the difference between just initializing a form control the old-fashioned way and using form builder, and then they mix and match and get unexpected results, not realizing that by calling form builder, it's just a slightly different syntax. Okay. So when we look at form array name, this is what's going to allow us to avoid different situations that are not fun to deal with. So if we have some sort of form group and we have an array inside there and it's named favorites, if we want to be able to access that directly, that's how we can do the form, or we could use the form array name directive to just say directives. If we didn't do that, we would have to take our parent level form, we'd have to go into that and we'd say parent group, okay, look at the controls, and then inside the controls and iterate and iterate and iterate. This way we can access it with a name value instead. So that allows us to do something like this. So in our top example, we've got our form array name of flowers. Inside of this form array, we've got groups that have form controls in them, and there's a control that's type and a control that's color. So in the first one, we are basically having to iterate over all of those controls, and then again use the form control name and then iterate inside of that control to get the control and then get the control name. Instead, if we are using the form group directive, I can add this form group directive here, and and I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, this is going to be the form name group flower, and inside of this form array, we're going to have multiple groups of a form named flower, and each of those form groups have type and have color. And so this allows me to use that form control name directive then to directly access those. A little readable, a little easier to debug in my opinion, instead of going multiple levels deep trying to iterate through these controls. This is really helpful for when we're dealing with, again, complex forms, where this is an example where we have a form group at the top level. It's got a control inside of it, and then it's got another form array inside of it, and inside of that form array, it's got multiple form controls. So we have dynamic control over each of these pieces. We can access different validation at the control level, but we can also highlight at that parent form array level and that parent form group level. So those are all available and at your disposal just by using these name directives. And then real quick, this is what the form builder syntax looks like. It's just shorthand, so instead of saying new form array and then passing in information, we can just call formBuilder.array. It's going to assume that you're going to pass in an array to it with whatever you want there. And then here we're initializing this by calling this.formBuilder.group. That's creating a new group, and then inside of there, when we are passing in just an object, it's going to assume where we're saying first name, that's a new form control. So instead of new form control, it's just saying, okay, hey, here's our key, and then the value is whatever information we're getting from that form control. All right, so that was Form Archaeology 102. Now we are going to get into the form, what I call super elite hacks. These are some very in-depth topics, and so I've got more breakout resources for you, but they, again, can get you out of the trickiest form situations just using what's available in the ReactiveForms API. So the two things we're going to talk about are the control value accessor and the control container. So first up is the control value accessor. This is the definition from Angular. It creates a bridge to DOM elements, from DOM elements to form controls. And I feel like this is not a very helpful description. So it's easier to kind of look at it. So the first thing to know is the control value accessor is just an interface, which is basically saying, all right, if you're going to do this and implement this interface, you need to implement these certain things for this to act correctly. The first thing is a method called writeValue. This is going to handle writing a value to a form control. So if we were to set a value manually on something, we would want to be able to do this. We have our register on change. So if there's some sort of change event, the value of our form changes, and then register untouched. We want to track if somebody has interacted with our form or not. There's a fourth optional method called setDisabledState. This is just optional, it's not required, but this allows us to set disabled state for our control if necessary. So a great example of implementing control value accessor is, let's say you're dealing with a third-party web component library, and this is actually a real use case. Angular Material used to only work with template-driven forms. And so if you wanted to have a reactive form and you wanted to implement something from Angular Material that did not work well, and you might reach towards event emitters or outputs or something like that, but in reality what you can do is create a new component, slap your old-fashioned template-driven form, whatever inside of there, and then that component can implement the control value accessor interface. And then what you can do is hook into the different events that you need from this third-party component, and then make sure you're able to write a value to it if the value, if the set value method is called on the parent control, and then implement your change and your touched event and kind of create this wrapper, and then not have to worry about any of that. And you can use this as in your ReactiveForms as intended. So our wrapper component is going to look something like this, where we are implementing our control value accessor interface. We have to provide the ng value accessor, and then basically use existing to make sure that Angular is aware of this new component, and that's what it takes to kind of wrap this and implement it appropriately. There are a couple other different ways that you can do it. This is actually how Angular handles all of their elements under the hood. So if you've ever just created an input in Angular, this is all done for you under the hood. It's actually implementing the control value accessor already. And this is how they do things, where they look at different selectors, they look for those form control directives, and that's how they wire this all this up. And so this is an example directive that you could create. So let's say you are building your own third-party component library, and instead of wrapping your components, you just want to write a selector and say, hey, anytime we use this web component, we're going to target it, and then we're going to get our input change and our blur events, and then we're going to execute our handle change and handle blur events, just implementing the control value accessor interface. So this is what that would look like. And then finally, this is actually Angular code of what Angular has done under the hood. So if we are looking at the default value accessor, this is how Angular is targeting all of the different inputs to get these input events, get these blur events to create their actual form controls that act the way you expect them to inside of the ReactiveForms module. So it's just kind of cool to like peek under the hood and see what's going on there. It seems like black magic until you realize, no, this is just the way they've actually written this. It's just hard for people to understand until they really get into it. That was a very, very quick overview. So I do have demo code available at this GitHub repo, and there's an entire ngconf talk on that. And then next up is the control container. And so this is for any time that we want to have a parent form group that is spread across multiple instances, maybe multiple routes, maybe multiple components. This is a way to access kind of a parent level form control. So this could look something like this, where we've got a form group inside of a component, but then we have this other component that we've created called app address that may contain additional form information. We want to be able to populate this form, but we want to be able to access the parent sample form that it's inside of, and control container is how we can do that. So this is our example component, and then if we move down to our address component, what we can do here is we can simply get the control container, and then inside that control container, that's going to basically walk up the tree looking for instances of form control or form group, and then give us access to that parent control. So then when we use we have access to our original form group, so when we go to use our form control name lookup to look up a key inside of that form group, it's able to find it for us. So that's how we can bridge that gap. Again, this is a very quick overview. That I want you to know that this is there, and this is available. So there's more information, again, demo code, and an entire talk just about this. I do have these slides linked online, so if you're like frantically trying to get photos, I know this is a quick talk. So all these are going to be there and available for you, so don't freak out. You can take a photo of the last slide. All right, so form archaeology guides. I want to go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, these different form scenarios, and I kind of want to revisit them, look at the knowledge that we've learned that's available to us from the API, and talk about how to do that. So the first example was setting an input's requiredness based on other inputs. We want one input to be required if another input has a value. This is how we would go about using it with all the information from the Forms API. We would hook into the value changes observable of the form control that we care about, understanding if it has a value or not. And when it has that value, then we will call the set validators method on the dependent form control. This is going to allow us to set new validators on it based on whatever our information is. Once we've done that, we're going to call a third method called update value and validity. So we've put a new validator in our form control. We want Angular to rerun change detection with this new validator in consideration, so it'll reflect accordingly what the status of that control should be. And we can do that by using the update value and validity method. Again, these methods all there and available on the abstract control class, that slide that I talked through in the beginning. Next up, we want to talk about handling custom validation. So this is that example of trying to book a flight with a departure and a return date. What we can do is we can get that first comparison value. We create our custom function that is going to compare our two different values and pass that into our form control through the validation function. And then that's going to allow us to take those dynamic values, match them up against whatever we care about, and then determine whether something is valid or not. For adding and removing inputs dynamically, this is how we use form arrays. So a form array is just like an array in JavaScript that, we have a list of items, they have indexes, and so this will allow us to insert into it, but also remove things out of it. So what we can do is we can iterate over our form array that is going to have however many controls inside of it in our template, and then we're going to use our form control directive anytime we have a form control inside of that array to bind it. And then the form array class that's built on top of the abstract control class has a couple additional methods for us. It has a push method, an insert at, and a remove, or insert, excuse me, and remove at. So push is going to add a new form control to the end of the list, just takes a parameter of the form control. Insert is going to allow us to insert a new form control at a certain index, and then remove at is going to take an index for whatever number that we want to remove out of that form array. So by using the form array and these different methods, that's how we can add and remove inputs dynamically. Creating custom reusable form elements. So, component libraries, again, are a great example of this. Web component libraries. We can create a component that implements the control value accessor interface. There are a number of different ways, as long as we have our register on change, register on touched, and set value methods for how our user interacts with the component. That will work correctly. And then we can use our form control directive to bind to our custom element, and it's going to treat it just the same as it would an input or a radio or any other select that we're used to dealing with. Same thing for consuming a third-party web component library. We can wrap that and then make sure our directive implements all the correct data to wire that up. And then finally, for creating forms dynamically based on JSON, we can iterate over that JSON object, have a good idea of what that structure should look like, and everything that we need to do to reflect that structure is going to be available from form groups, which are objects, form arrays, which are arrays, and then form controls, which are just our basic key value pairs. For accessing form groups across components or across routes, this is how we use a control container to kind of walk up the tree, get access to a parent level form group, and then be able to call certain form controls or form groups or form arrays from inside of there. A couple best practices, pitfalls, tips, and tricks. The number one thing, I coach people to avoid the need to map or transform values. I see people do kind of like forms very disparately, and then the end step try and patch things together. You're really opening yourself up to a lot of weirdness that can happen. And so if you start with the end result in mind of how you want to submit your data and then work backwards just using form control, form group, and form array, it's a much easier way to go, and you're going to have less to test because you're relying on Angular to do most of that heavy lifting. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm a little behind on time. If you are ever starting to write an event emitter when dealing with Angular forms, that is a code smell to me. Most of your problems can probably be solved by using the control value accessor or the control container. So if you find yourself doing this, take a look at what you're doing, maybe pull up these slides and see if there's a better option available. If you ever need to highlight untouched fields, this is something that we didn't get until Angular 8. We would have to iterate over over our controls inside of a group manually and call mark as touched on each control. In Angular 8, we now have mark all as touched, so that's going to allow us to mark everything inside of a form group or a form array. It makes it really convenient. People get really confused about set value or patch value and understanding the difference here. Set value, exact match. Patch value is going to patch in whatever it can. So if you've ever gotten errors or something like that because you've tried to use set value and you don't know everything, that's why. Set value is for when you know exactly what you're setting. Patch value is when you only know some of the things that you're setting. Reset is also really confusing. I feel like a lot of people don't understand how it works under the hood. So if you look at Angular's implementation, this is what's happening. It's a lot of basically resetting a form to be pristine, like it's never been interacted with, setting it to an initial value if there was, and then clearing out any pending changes. All right. I want to quickly mention that in Angular v14, we did get strictly typed forms. This has been one of the most demanded features in Angular for I don't even know how long. And so this is going to allow us to actually type out our forms. The first line, this is going to assume, because I've passed an initial value of a string, that it is always going to do a string. So if I ever call the set value method with a number, I'm going to get an error because TypeScript is like, hey, whoa, I thought the value of this form control is supposed to be a string. So this gives us a lot of power that we haven't been able to deal with in the past. We got a couple new types with this. We have an untyped form array for form arrays with different elements. We have a form record, which tracks the collection of form control instances that have the same types, a little caveat there. And then we also have non-nullable form builder. So if we want to specify that our value can never be null, that is what we can do with our form builder syntactic sugar. All right. If you are not in Angular v14 and you are struggling with typings, especially because you've implemented strict templates in Angular, you can also use getters to assert types when needed. So if you are trying to reference a form array, for instance, inside of your template, you can use a getter there and say, hey, you know, I'm going to go ahead and let the compiler know this is a type of form array, and then you can use that getter inside of your template. All right, we are about 5 minutes over time, but I think we might be eating into a break. So this is the slide to take pictures of. The slides and all the information are available at Hidden Secrets, forumsapi.jenniferwadella.com. If you have any questions or weird situations that you've run into forums that you feel like was not answered in this talk, I would love to hear from you. And if your team ever needs Angular help with implementing forums, that's my email. So if you're like, oh, we're in a crisis, we can't figure this out, we need help, we need Angular experts, happy to do that. All right, but that is what I have for y'all today. So I hope you have a lovely rest of the conference, you wonderful human beings.